terror and desperation, the civilians scrambling to get away from Putin's merciless onslaught. From the elderly to the very young, this is what it means to grab your family and run. Rohit is on the road with the refugees.
My family go to east, I go to war.
You're going to war?
Yes, it's my land.
Ukraine has furiously rejected Russia's offer of safe corridors after it said only those who seek refuge in Russia and in Belarus will be protected. As the war rages, a warning 5 million could try to flee. So many already to Poland, Rebecca meets the young dancer whose dreams lie in the dust.
My life is dance. Where are my favorite friends? People who I loved.
Uproar over the government's visa rules for Ukrainian refugees. In Calais, we meet the family who has British relatives who cannot get through. An historic moment in the Commons tomorrow, a video link from President Zelensky direct to British MPs. The US hints at a ban on buying Russian energy. The economic shock of the war hits prices at the pumps here. So how bad could it get? And the bride wore camouflage, how love and life still shone through at this wartime wedding.
This is ITV News at 10 with Julie Etchingham.
Good evening. It is a fate most of us would struggle to comprehend. Facing merciless bombardment from Vladimir Putin's forces, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians must abandon their homes and get out. With them, they take only whatever or even whoever they can carry with their hands and on their back. The question is where to go in a country being reduced to ruins. Moscow's proposal to the very people its troops are attacking was to offer supposedly safe passage to Russia, an idea dismissed as completely immoral by Ukraine and something we'll hear more about shortly. But first to Irpin on the outskirts of Kiev. There, people's only thought is to get out while they can. And as Rohit discovered, it is a perilous journey being made by children and the elderly alike.
To cross the river is perilous. To not cross it is far more so. This is the escape from Irpin, where the lucky leave alive. As the sound of shelling moved closer, not everyone had the good fortune to be able to run. This was hardly a dash for safety, but it was no less desperate. An elderly woman struggling to keep up. Other evacuees streaming past as she inched towards safety. Tell me what last night was like.
It was hell. It was scary and it was hell. Proper hell.
Then we spot another group emerging from underneath the broken bridge. Some have left with few possessions from long and settled lives, but if this looks like agony, imagine those they left behind.
I panicked a lot, especially this at night. But this sound, as you can hear now, is not comparing to that which were struggling this night, because it was light and warm and the whole building is shaking, and we have been sitting in the doorway like half a night.
They've now reached the end of one road, the start of another. Where are you going now?
To Kiev railway station.
And where are you going after that?
After my family go to east, I go to war.
You're going to war?
Yes, it's my land.
Then another evacuee arrives with news from the town beyond Irpin. It's done for, he says. Everyone has been killed. A moment to reflect does nothing to help.
Про яку вообще, я не знаю, гуманність можна говорити у цьому світі, коли нас просто уничтожають всю страну. У нас страна невелика, ну в нас усе є, ми всім довольні, в нас усе є. Як можна дозволити усьому білому світу стерти нас з лиця землі і нікому?
The next stop is towards Kyiv, along the same route Russian troops want to take.
На железнодорожний вокзал і все. Ми більше нічого не знаємо. Ні, ми самі просто їдемо. Куди можемо, туди тікаємо. Нас ніхто організований. Чай, кофе хотите?
We're invited into one of the tower blocks in the path of Russia's advance, where for now some refuse to go anywhere. So why doesn't she leave and get on one of those buses outside?
Не знаю.
I don't know.
У меня нет ответа.
I don't have an answer for that.
Пока вот.
At Kyiv's central train station, those who did leave Irpin are taken west, as far as they can go. One man tells us he was hit by Russian bullets on his way here. Who shot you?
Российские солдаты. Видел ихнюю технику с буквой В.
Across the waiting room, he spots his wife. They'll travel to Lviv together.
Да, я вважаю, що нам дуже повезло.
У нас сьогодні
Це наш
день народження.
день народження, так.
They are not alone in making a journey which would have seemed unthinkable 10 days ago. An escape from shootings and shrapnel means an escape from home. Except for the men who must stay behind to fight. All this is the painful consequence of the decision of one man. Rohit Katru, News at 10, Kyiv.
Well, while Kyiv itself has so far been spared the worst of the fighting, the same cannot be said for cities like Mariupol. There, civilians remain surrounded and under fire with limited access to food or water. It's a situation the US Secretary of State today compared to the siege of Leningrad during the Second World War. Well, the city is a key target for Russian troops as they attempt to advance across Ukraine. Invading forces continue attack from the north, east and the south. They have offered to create humanitarian corridors, but only to take people in Kyiv north to Belarus and from Kharkiv, Mariupol and Sumy east to Russia itself. It was an idea which Ukraine unsurprisingly rejected as unacceptable. And even with that offer and a supposed ceasefire to allow evacuations to take place, Russia was accused of continuing to shell the cities, preventing civilians from making their escape. Today, a third round of peace talks made little progress, meaning there is still no end in sight for the people suffering the most in this conflict.
The horrors of the bombardments on Ukraine's Black Sea coast are almost entirely invisible to the outside world. But this is what hundreds of thousands are living through. These Ukrainian drone pictures claim to show Russian rocket artillery. The images at night are, if anything, even more horrifying.
At the moment, we are ready to make evacuation from Mariupol to Zaporizhia, and we're ready to transfer humanitarian materials to our city. But there is continuous shelling in Mariupol, and we did not have confirmation about safety corridor.
Humanitarian corridors have been offered out of towns like Irpin on the outskirts of Kiev, where civilians fleeing suffered horribly over the weekend. But the offer is only for routes into Russia or Belarus, described by the Ukrainians as absurd, cynical and unacceptable. And who of these would want to run into the arms of an enemy who's done this to them? Helicopters have brought the negotiators back to the intermittent peace talks taking place on Ukraine's border with Belarus. Terms have been offered to the Ukrainians that would amount to abject surrender and the partition and neutralization of their country. President Zelensky is not about to accept. We will never forgive the shooting of innocent people, he said, the destruction of our infrastructure. We'll never forgive hundreds and hundreds of victims, thousands and thousands who've suffered. And God will not forgive, not today, not tomorrow, never. The Ukrainians have suffered terribly and lost much ground, but they remain a long way from defeat. After 11 days of fighting, they continue to wreak havoc on Russian supply columns and even on their armoured vehicles. In the skies, they continue to score successes. This, a Russian aircraft being shot down above Kharkiv, to the evident joy of the defenders. But a new and bitter battle is being fought in the southern city of Mykolaiv, which holds the key to Odessa and complete Russian control of Ukraine's Black Sea coast. It's being defended fiercely, but the battle here may decide the whole of the southern front. The peace negotiators say tonight that they hope at the fourth time of asking tomorrow to get a humanitarian corridor operating out of Mariupol. As for the terms that Ukraine has been offered at those peace talks, there is no chance of them accepting them at this stage. There is a long way to go in this war before either side believes it's won all it can on the battlefield. James Mace, News at 10, Kiev.
Well, it was hoped that some of those under siege in Mariupol would be able to be evacuated to Zaporizhzhia in the southeast of Ukraine. But for the third straight day, it hasn't happened. Dan is there tonight, where there is a curfew and blackout in operation. Dan, yet another day with no safe passage through. It is an increasingly desperate situation. Is there any more hope for tomorrow?
Well, within the last hour, Julie, the Russians have again made this offer of humanitarian corridors. This time they're saying not only that people could leave Mariupol from into Russia, but they could also come here to Zaporizhzhia. Whether that transpires or not, as you say, this is the third day when we've been waiting for this to happen and it hasn't transpired. They are saying that the Ukrainians need to respond to this proposal within the next 2 hours to sort out the details. And I think what has been the problem up till now has been the nitty-gritty detail. The Red Cross is saying that the route that had been suggested on previous days took them through mined territory, and clearly that wasn't going to be acceptable. There's also questions about whether this is just for women and children or whether men of fighting age will be allowed to come out as well. So a lot of discussion about the details, but there is once again tonight now fresh hope that perhaps the siege of 400,000 people in Mariupol will perhaps be released soon. If they do make it here, a city, as you say, that is under blackout and under curfew, there are people waiting for them with supplies, with clothes that they've gathered here to try and give them some comfort.
Let's just hope they get that safe passage. Dan, thank you very much indeed for that. Well, with Ukraine's president continuing to call on NATO to do more to help his country, US President Joe Biden today held talks with Boris Johnson and the leaders of France and Germany about the war. Emma's in Washington tonight for us to bring us up to date on this transatlantic united condemnation for Russia's treatment of civilians in Ukraine. Emma.
Yes, indeed. That conversation was very much about the events of the past days and the horror that they have seen unfold in Ukraine, and also how they can try to bring this situation to pass to an easier settlement. But really, not an awful lot came out of that conversation. They had lots of ideas as what could be done, but indeed it is only the actions of one man, and that man was not in the phone calls, so they didn't really get an awful lot further. This afternoon, we've also heard from the United Nations meeting in the Security Council, once again condemning Russia. They called this meeting to highlight the unfolding humanitarian catastrophe. And we heard that 1.7 million refugees have been created just in the space of the last 11 days. There was also further condemnation for the fact that people trying to escape were being shelled. But what stood out to me were the statements from the Russian ambassador himself. He sat in that chamber in front of all others and said that no, Russia was not shelling any civilians. The shelling was being done by the Ukrainians. As he spoke, more shells were falling in Ukraine.
Indeed, Emma, thank you very much indeed for that. Well, as Emma was saying there, nearly 2 million Ukrainians have now crossed into neighbouring countries since the war began, the majority of them, of course, to Poland. We met some of those who have found refuge there, who, in just a few short days, have seen their dreams for the future dashed. They've left behind homes, careers and loved ones, and there's no knowing if they will ever return to them.
For more than a century, this auditorium celebrated Ukrainian culture. Now, suddenly, a sanctuary for those forced out of their beloved homeland. In this one room, we find such different lives thrown together, united by trauma and grief. 14-year-old Anya and her mother Oksana worry for her dad, left behind in Odessa.
I'm nervous a little bit, because my father is at home and I'm scared about him.
Then we meet 14-year-old Bogdan as he helps his mum, who has a brain tumour. They fled with enough medication to last a month and a half. Natalia tells me her son is supporting her, but she's scared. Too much responsibility on these shoulders.
Of course, I help my mother because
but he tells me he's worried about finding the drugs she needs. In between the camp beds, 18-year-old Nadia, who was training to be a dancer in Kiev, wants to show us a glimpse of her previous existence.
My life is dance, and I want to come back to my lovely academia, where my favorite friends, people who I loved.
Then Irina starts to play the piano, a song about missing home. The windows in our house were shattered by a rocket, she cries. Comforted by her daughter, but there's little solace here. Rebecca Barry, News at 10, Przemysl, Poland.
Well, back across the border in Ukraine, we can join Romilly now. She's in Lviv in western Ukraine, where many of the refugees are passing through on the way to Poland. Huge pressure on that western city, Romilly, as they try to absorb people en route to cross the border. What's the situation like there?
It's pretty bleak, Julie. Lviv, this great cultured city in the west, has become a sort of staging post of misery. There are tens of thousands of people arriving here every day. As you saw in Rebecca's report, a lot of them do want to go to Poland or further into Europe, but many of them want to try and stay in Ukraine, either because they're just hoping against hope that they are going to be able to return home at some point, or because they can't bear to leave their husbands, sons, brothers who are having to stay here and having to fight. And so far, Lviv is doing this extraordinary job, this sort of ad hoc community-led job of trying to match people who have a spare room or a place on their floor with families who need shelter. But that worked then when there were thousands of people coming. Now there are tens of thousands of people coming. And the mayor said today that Lviv can't cope anymore and pleaded with aid organisations to come and help. It is really cold here tonight. The temperature's due to get down to -11. And there are families arriving tonight with children who just don't know where they're going to stay.
OK, Romilly, thank you very much indeed for that update from there. Well, another country where many refugees are heading is Moldova, which sits between Ukraine and Romania. It has a population of 2.6 million people, and so far around 230,000 refugees have either passed through or now need accommodation there. Well, in the east of the country is Transnistria, an unrecognised Russian-backed region run by separatists. There are concerns in Moldova that if President Putin takes southern Ukrainian cities like Odessa, he may not stop there. With Russian troops already stationed in Transnistria, Moldovans fear the breakaway region could be used to justify an invasion. Well, Peter's in Moldova for us tonight. And Peter, that influx of refugees is causing particular challenges there.
It is, and we hear about those Ukrainians who've fled their homes. Let me show you what's waiting for them on the other side. This is an example of a refugee bed in a sports centre in Moldova's capital. It's the warmth of the people who are bringing them in that is one of the heartwarming parts of this tragedy. But we are now reporting from Moldova on a refugee crisis that's looming, because those hundreds of thousands coming this way are relying on volunteers like this. And while there are still beds here ready for the next wave, the problem is that that next wave is about to come. Moldova is already taking more than its fair share. More than 200,000 have come through the border here since the war began. That's 10% of this country's entire population. To put that into context, that's a significant strain on resources for one of Europe's smallest and poorest countries. And Liz Truss, the UK Foreign Secretary, today said she was seriously concerned about a crisis looming on the Moldovan border, not just because with the imminent attack expected on Odessa, a fresh wave of refugees coming, but with Transnistria on the border, with those Russian peacekeepers, a phrase we're familiar with, and also Europe's biggest ammunition depot, this has the potential to be an explosive situation.
Peter, thank you very much indeed for that. Well, here Boris Johnson promised the government would offer a generous system to allow Ukrainian refugees to come to the UK. To some, it certainly hasn't felt that way so far. Relatives of British nationals have become stuck at Calais because they either don't have the right paperwork or, worse, have discovered they aren't considered eligible. Well, tonight the Home Office said 300 visas have been issued out of nearly 9,000 applications submitted since Friday.
For some, there is comfort in doing something that feels familiar. Others here are just trying to pass the time. All, like Maya and her family, are waiting. They want to get to the UK, but at the moment they're stuck in Calais. Maya has already travelled thousands of miles with her elderly mother and mother-in-law, her 12-year-old son and the family dog. I had to leave my older son and husband behind, she told me. My family is waiting for me in the UK. I have no family in other countries, so the UK seemed the best choice. Waiting for them in Oxfordshire is Valentina. She's a cousin, but under UK rules, that doesn't count as immediate or extended family, and so doesn't guarantee them entry.
We don't have any choice. We have to believe and trust. But what is the next step? Please tell us what the next step, what we can do, what we have to do.
Most of these families have been on the road for days. This is somewhere they can rest, and these people here are queuing now so they can get a hot dinner. But what everyone we've spoken to here today has told us is that they appear to be looking at a much longer wait to get their visa application sorted. Here, it is left to volunteers to help them fill out long and complicated forms, which are written in a foreign language. Oksana is waiting to hear whether she and her 3 children can join her husband, who already lives and works in England.
It's very difficult to understand this information in this application and how to do it.
The government said today that it has sent people to help, but insisted that proper checks were important.
We have staff in Calais, and importantly, people have been coming to the UK from Calais. So we are not, I'm afraid there's been a lot of misinformation as well around all of this.
But the sign that greets Ukrainians when they get here suggests otherwise, telling people they'll have to go back to Paris or Brussels to get their visa. For those who have made it this far, The journey has already been long and difficult enough. Chloe Keedy, News at 10, Calais.
Another source of criticism for the government has been its actions, or perceived lack thereof, against Russian oligarchs who have invested dirty money in the UK. Tonight it is pushing through new laws, the aim of which is to leave them nowhere to hide their illicit wealth. Tomorrow, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky will make an historic virtual address to the House of Commons.
A super yacht owned by Igor Sechin, a billionaire oligarch closer to Putin than most, seized last week by the French authorities after Sechin was sanctioned. And this one, owned by Russia's richest man, Alexei Mordashov, also seized by the Italians. Symbols perhaps of how the EU and US have seemingly been tougher on those who bankroll the Kremlin than Boris Johnson's government, though today he said all that would change thanks to a new law being rushed through Parliament.
We are making sure that we have new powers to distrain, to take people's assets.
Before today, the UK's economic war against Russia, its sanctions included freezing the assets of some Russian banks, closing banks out of the SWIFT money transfer system, and banning Russian planes and ships from our shores. The new economic crime bill will make it easier to sanction Putin's allies by piggybacking on sanctions imposed by the US and EU, and compel foreign owners of UK property to reveal their identities. The point is that the UK became a home from home for dodgy Russian money.
As the Russia report from the Intelligence and Security Committee a few years ago said, the UK has offered ideal mechanisms by which illicit finance could be recycled through what has been referred to as the London laundromat. That is damning.
But the lifeblood of the Russian economy is oil and gas, and the West is still buying billions of dollars of the stuff every week, and there are as yet no sanctions on that stuff.
There's a lot of debate going on about energy sanctions, and here we should not make a mistake. We have to ensure that they don't generate unmanageable risks to energy supplies in European countries and beyond.
The Russian son of a KGB officer.
I, Evgeny Lord Lebedev.
Lord Lebedev of Siberia, who's the owner of the London Evening Standard newspaper. The PM made him a peer, having overturned reservations of security officers. So does the PM regret ennobling Lebedev?
This should not turn into a general sense that we're against Russians. Any Russian living in the UK, any Russian who contributes to UK society should suddenly be under suspicion.
Volodymyr Zelensky, president and hero of Ukraine, who tomorrow will make a historic address by Zoom to our own House of Commons. However much we're punishing the Russian economy, he'll tell our MPs they need to do more to help him and his people, and fast. Robert Peston, News at 10.
It'll be quite a moment. Well, those sanctions Robert mentioned and others from around the world are, of course, designed to hurt Russia. But as we've already seen, they're causing economic pain here too. Today, with talk of a US ban on Russian energy, oil and gas prices hit new highs, costs which will tighten the squeeze on household budgets. Well, Joel's here to talk to us about this. First of all, how likely is it that the Americans will actually go ahead with this ban?
It's possible, Julie. The United States is itself a big producer of oil. The prospect it might was enough to rattle investors. Note the German Chancellor very quickly suggested that Europe had no such plans to do anything of the sort. Energy price shocks are extremely painful. History tells us they can tip economies into recession. Brent crude was $69 a barrel a year ago. It rose to $94 when Russia invaded Ukraine and has since surged to $123 a barrel. The wholesale price in the UK of natural gas has also headed north. It's trading at just above £5 a therm. A year ago, Julie, it was 50 pence a therm. What's happening is extraordinary. It will impact anyone who fills up a car, anyone who uses gas or electricity to heat their home, anyone who shops a supermarket. It will affect, in short, absolutely everybody. The government's under enormous pressure to row back on plans for the national insurance rise, to cut fuel duty. Earlier, I spoke to Lord Jim O'Neill, an economist who was part of David Cameron's government. He told me the current oil price is similar to the one we experienced at the end of the 1970s, and the risk of recession has risen significantly.
I can't really see how many normal people are going to be able to absorb this scale of price increase to their daily and weekly lives without some huge adjustments to how they can spend. And people will feel a lot poorer unless these prices reverse significantly.
Russia is the world's third largest producer of oil, so in theory, Julie, it's making a lot of money at the moment. In practice, though, there are evidence that it's having to offer pretty big discounts to buyers. There are no sanctions on oil currently. The threat there might be, though, is enough to cool demand. Russia's economy is being pummeled. Western governments have frozen assets. Western companies are pulling out. Russians are withdrawing their money from Russian banks, and the value of the ruble, of course, has sunk. Russia faces the prospect of a severe recession or a financial crisis, or perhaps both.
OK, Rachel, thank you very much indeed for that. Some other news now, and the Queen has held her first in-person engagement since catching coronavirus. Her guest, Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, said the Queen was as insightful as ever. It's thought the blue and yellow flowers on display were a subtle show of support to the people of Ukraine. And tributes have been paid to the actress Linda Barron, who's died aged 82. She was best known as Nurse Gladys Emanuel in the BBC sitcom Open All Hours. She also appeared in the children's show Come Outside and EastEnders. Finally tonight, if Vladimir Putin hoped to shatter Ukrainian unity, he has surely achieved the opposite. Their love for one another and their country has been the antithesis to the hate which has been raining down. And what better example than a marriage on the front line, one couple's bond showing how love and life finds a way even in dark times.
The bride wore camouflage, and so did the groom. But there was no disguising their love for one another. Fellow reservists carried weapons but threw flower petals. The Orthodox Christian wedding of Lesya Ivashenko and Valery Filimonov was unorthodox in almost every way. In a traditional ceremony, a crown would be held above the bride's head. The alternative was more in keeping with their surroundings close to the front line.
I'm happy, completely happy, despite all this really awful time, but because this man, it's my love of my life.
They'd been partners for years, but only recently took up arms to defend their country. With the future unclear, they felt now was the time to marry. Members of the media were also invited to witness the wedding. The authorities here know the value of a story which raises morale. So former world heavyweight champion and current mayor of Kyiv, Vitaly Klitschko, offered his blessing. There will be no honeymoon. All is unfair in love and war. Ian Woods, News at 10.
Taking happiness where they can find it, that is where we leave you tonight. From all of us here, good night. We'll see you tomorrow.